If you thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only time humanity almost deleted itself, you are wrong. Dead wrong. Most people think the Cold War was a straight line of tension that slowly faded away until David Hasselhoff sang on the Berlin Wall. But that is not true. In the early 1980s, the world actually got closer to nuclear war than at any time since 1960-2. This was the new Cold War, and it was darker, grittier, and way more terrifying than the first one. Let us set the scene. The year is 1970-9. The vibe is bad. The United States is suffering from a crisis of confidence. They just lost the Vietnam War. Their economy is in the toilet stagflation. And their president, Jimmy Carter, is a nice guy who honestly seems too nice for the Shark Tank of geopolitics. He is talking about human rights and installing solar panels on the White House. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviet leadership is old. I mean really old. Leonid Brezhnev is practically a mummy. He can barely speak without a script. But the Soviet military machine is humming. They look at America and see weakness. They see a wounded animal. And like any predator, they decide it is time to expand. In December 1970-9, the Soviets make the fatal mistake that will eventually kill their empire. They look at the map at a rugged mountainous country called Afghanistan. The communist government there is failing. So the Soviets decide to help. On Christmas Eve, thousands of Soviet tanks and paratroopers cross the border. They think it will be a quick police action. In undoubt, 6 months, maybe a year. It was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. This invasion shocked the world. It killed détente instantly. Détente was the idea that, hey, maybe we can just coexist. The invasion of Afghanistan proved that the Soviets were still hungry for land. Jimmy Carter was furious. He boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which really only punished the athletes who had been training for 4 years. He cut off grain sales, but it looked weak. The American people were angry. They were tired of losing. They were tired of being pushed around. They wanted a cowboy. Enter Ronald Reagan. Reagan is the ultimate character trope for this era. He was an actor. He was charismatic. He was optimistic. And he viewed the world in simple black and white terms. The Soviet Union wasn't just a rival. It was the evil empire. He didn't want to contain them. He wanted to beat them. When Reagan won the election in 1980, it sent a shiver down the spine of the Kremlin. The Soviets didn't understand Reagan. They thought he was a madman, a dangerous cowboy with his finger on the nuclear button. And Reagan played into this fear perfectly. His strategy was economic warfare. He knew the Soviet economy was a house of cards held together by oil exports and vodka. He knew they couldn't afford a new arms race. So he started the biggest arms race in history. He opened the fire hose of money for the US military. New tanks, new stealth bombers, a 600-ship navy. The message to Moscow was simple. We are going to spend you into bankruptcy. Try to keep up. And the Soviets panicked. This panic led to one of the most secret and dangerous operations of the entire Cold War operation, RYAN. RYAN is a Russian acronym for Raytino-, Yadro no Napaden, i.e., which translates to nuclear missile attack. It sounds like a bad Tom Clancy novel, but it was real. In 1980-, one Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB and later of the Soviet Union, became convinced that Reagan was planning a surprise nuclear first strike. He thought Reagan was going to sucker punch the Soviet Union into oblivion. So Andropov ordered every KGB agent in the world to look for signs of an imminent attack. What were these signs? They were bizarre. Agents were told to watch the number of lights on at the British Ministry of Defense at night. They were told to check the price of blood at blood banks because you need blood for war. They were old to watch if bankers and generals were moving their families out of cities. It was confirmation bias on steroids. Every time a light stayed on late, in London a KGB agent in Moscow wrote down the war is coming. The paranoia was feeding itself. Andregan kept poking the bear. He authorized aggressive naval exercises. In 1980-1 and 80-2 American fleets sailed deep into Soviet waters in the Barents Sea. They sailed right up to the Soviet naval bases just to see what the Russians would do. It was the geopolitical equivalent of driving your car onto your neighbor's lawn and doing donuts just to see if he calls the cops. The Soviets were terrified. They put their bombers on standby. They loaded nukes onto their planes. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then on March 23, 1983, Reagan dropped the biggest bomb of all. But it wasn't a nuke. It was a speech. He went on TV and announced the Strategic Defense Initiative SDI. The press mocked it. They called it Star Wars. The idea was to build a shield in space satellites with lasers and particle beams that could shoot down Soviet missiles before they hit America. Now let us be real for a second. The technology for this did not exist. It was science fiction. Reagan was basically promising to build a force field. But to the Soviets, this was their worst nightmare. Why? Because of the logic of mutually assured destruction, MAD. MAD works like this. If I shoot you, you shoot me, and we both die. It keeps the peace because nobody can win. But if America has a shield, suddenly America can shoot the Soviets, cannot shoot back. It breaks the balance. It makes a first strike winnable. The Kremlin looked at Star Wars and saw a death sentence. They knew they couldn't build their own shield. Their computers were huge clunky things that used vacuum tubes while Americans were inventing the Macintosh. They were losing the tech war. And if they couldn't compete, they fell backed into a corner. A cornered animal is dangerous. This brings us to 1983. Historians now call this the year of maximum danger. If 1960-2 was a sprint to the edge of the cliff, 1980-3 was a slow sleepwalk towards it. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And then tragedy struck. On the night of September 1, 1983, a Korean Airlines Boeing 747 Flight KIL-7 took off from New York headed for Seoul. It carried 216 people, including a U.S. congressman named Larry McDonald. It was a boring routine flight, but the pilots made a mistake, a tiny mistake. They set the autopilot to heading mode instead of inertial navigation mode. It meant the plane didn't follow its programmed path. It drifted, slowly, mile by mile. It drifted north. It drifted right into the most sensitive airspace on the planet, the Soviet Far East, over the Kamchatka Peninsula. This was where the Soviets tested their missiles. It was a fortress. The Soviet radar operators saw a blip. Target detected. Now put yourself in the shoes of the Soviet commander. You have spent 2 years being told by the KGB that the Americans are planning a sneak attack. You have seen American spy planes probing your borders every week. And now, in the middle of the night, a large plane is flying straight over your secret submarine base. They didn't think, oh, it is probably a lost airliner. They thought, this is it. This is the spy plane. Or maybe a bomber testing our defenses. They scrambled a fighter jet, a Sukhoi Su-15 flown by Major Gennady Osipovich. He flew up to intercept. It was pitch black. He saw the plane. He saw the navigation lights blinking. He saw the shape. It looked like a Boeing RC-135, an American spy plane that is built on the same frame as a 707. He radioed ground control. I see the target. Ground control asked, is it military? Osipovich didn't know. He didn't see windows. He just saw a silhouette. But the plane wasn't responding. Ground control gave the order, destroy the target. Osipovich dropped back. He locked on. He fired to air missiles. One missile hit the tail, the other hit the fuselage. The giant 747 spiraled out of the sky and crashed into the freezing sea of Japan. All 216 people died. When the news broke, the world exploded. Reagan went on TV. He was shaking with anger. He called it an act of barbarism. He used it to prove that the Soviet Union was morally bankrupt. They killed innocent civilians. The Soviets made it worse. First they lied. They said, "What plane? We didn't see a plane." Then, when the wreckage was found, they changed the story. Okay, we shot it, but it was a spy plane. The Americans used civilians as human shields. They refused to apologize. The relationship between Washington and Moscow hit absolute zero. Reagan deployed new nuclear missiles Pershing II to Europe. These missiles were fast. They could hit Moscow from Germany in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That is barely enough time to boil an egg, let alone decide to end the world. The Soviets were now convinced that war was inevitable. They were just waiting for the trigger. And then in November 1980-3 NATO decided to pull the pin on the grenade. They held a war game called Able Archer 83. War games happen all the time, but this one was different. It was designed to simulate the transition from conventional war to nuclear war. The scenario was that Orange forces, the Soviets, had attacked in blue forces, and ATO had to use nukes to stop them. The simulation was incredibly realistic. It used new cults. It involved the heads of government, like Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl. It went all the way up to DFCON-1 maximum readiness in the simulation. But remember Operation RYAN. The KGB spies were watching. They saw the codes changing. They saw the sudden spike in encrypted radio traffic. They saw troops moving. They didn't see a drill. They saw the cover for the real attack. In Moscow, the lights burned all night. The Soviet leadership went into the bunkers. They loaded nuclear warheads onto their bombers in East Germany and Poland. They put their submarines to sea. The Soviet nuclear forces were placed on trigger alert. This is the terrifying part. The Americans had no idea. The CIA didn't know the Soviets were freaking out. Reagan was just sitting in the White House, thinking, man, this exercise went well. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, a Soviet general was staring at a radar screen, wondering if today was the day he had to kill 100 million people. It was the ultimate misunderstanding. It was like reaching into your pocket to get your wallet and the cop thinks you are reaching for a gun. The only reason the world didn't end in November 1980-3 is because the exercise ended. The NATO troops went home. The radio traffic went back to normal. The Soviets slowly, cautiously lowered their guns. They exhaled. But the damage was done. The paranoia was baked in. Let us pause for a pattern interrupt. We talk about these leaders like they are chess masters moving pawns. But look at them. Brezhnev was addicted to sleeping pills. Andropov had kidney failure and was on dialysis. Chernenko, who came next, had emphysema. The Soviet Union was being run by a hospital ward. These were sick, tired old men making decisions about the apocalypse. It adds a layer of pathetic tragedy to the whole thing. They weren't evil geniuses. They were just scared and dying. And on the American side, you had Reagan, who was getting older too. He was idealistic, but he was surrounded by hawks who told him the Soviets are cheating. The Soviets are evil. It was an echo chamber. This brings us to the comment trap. I want to know what you think. Was Reagan's evil empire rhetoric necessary to push the Soviets to collapse, or did it just make the world more dangerous for no reason? Did he win the Cold War, or did he almost cause World War III? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. So we survived 1980-3. Barely, but something changed in Reagan. When he found out later from intelligence reports how scared the Soviets actually were, he was shocked. He wrote in his diary, 3 years had taught me something surprising about the Russians. Many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy were genuinely afraid of America and Americans. He realized that he couldn't just keep poking the bear. If the bear is too scared, it will bite. He needed to talk, but he needed a partner. And all the Soviet leaders kept dying. How am I supposed to get anywhere with the Russians if they keep dying on me? He joked. He needed someone new, someone different. And in 1980-5 he got him. A man named Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the anti-Brezhnev. He was 50-, for which in Soviet politics is basically a teenager. He had energy. He walked into crowds and shook hands. He had a charming wife named Teresa. He didn't look like a zombie. But Gorbachev inherited a disaster. The war in Afghanistan was dragging on. It was a bleeding well. Soviet mothers were receiving zinc coffins. The economy was stagnant. People were standing in line for 3 hours to buy toilet paper. The system was rotting from the inside. Gorbachev knew he had to fix it. He had two big ideas: perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost, openness, freedom of speech. He thought he could save communism by making it better. He thought if he let people talk and let factories make their own decisions, the Soviet Union would become a superpower again. He was wrong. He was trying to open a window to let in some fresh air, but he was living in a house of cards. The wind was going to blow the whole thing down. But before the collapse, we have the Summit-era. Reagan and Gorbachev meet. Geneva 1980-5. Reykjavik 1980-6. These meetings were wild. In Reykjavik, they almost agreed to abolish all nuclear weapons. Just get rid of them. The advisors were freaking out. Mr. President, you can't do that. But Reagan and Gorbachev had this weird chemistry. They argued about human rights, they argued about Star Wars, but they respected each other. However, there was a ticking time bomb in the Soviet Union. A literal one. On April 26, 1986 at 1:23 a.m., technicians at the V.I. a nuclear power plant in Ukraine were running a safety test. They turned off the safety systems. They pulled out the control rods. The reactor became unstable. It got hot. Then it got hotter. Then it exploded. Chernobyl. This event deserves its own atomic expansion. It wasn't just an explosion. It was the moment the Soviet Union lost its soul. The radiation was 500 times greater than Hiroshima. The graphite core burned for days, sending a plume of death into the atmosphere. And the Soviet response? Silence. They didn't tell the world. They didn't even tell the people in the nearby city of Pripyat. Children were playing outside while radioactive ash fell like snow on their hair. It is the most horrifying image of the Cold War. It took days for them to admit it, and they only admitted it because Sweden detected the radiation on their own workers' shoes. Chernobyl broke the Soviet Union. It cost billions of rubles to clean up money they didn't have. But more importantly, it destroyed the people's trust. If the government couldn't keep a nuclear plant safe and then lied about it while poisoning your kids, why should you listen to them? Gorbachev later said Chernobyl was the true cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the physical manifestation of the system's rot. So as we end part 1, we have a Soviet Union that is bleeding in Afghanistan, broke from the arms race and poisoned by radiation. The cracks are showing. The foundation is shaking. But the facade is still there. The Berlin Wall is still standing. The KGB is still watching. The empire looks solid from the outside. But in part 2 we are going to watch it crumble. We are going to see how a few shipyard workers in Poland and a picnic in Hungary started a landslide that wiped a superpower off the map. So we survived 1980-3. Barely. The world didn't end in a nuclear fireball, but the mood in Moscow was grim. It felt like a funeral home, and literally it was about to become one. Welcome to the era of the Walking Dead Soviet leadership. In the mid-80s, the Soviet Union wasn't just run by old men. It was run by dying men. Leonid Brezhnev died in 80-2. Yuri Andropov, the scary X-KGB boss, took over. He was smart, but his kidneys had quit on him years ago. He ruled from a hospital bed hooked up to dialysis machines, basically running an empire via post-it notes. He died in February 1980-4. Then came Konstantin Chernenko. This guy was 70-2 but looked 100. He had emphysema so bad, he couldn't even finish his own acceptance speech. The Soviet people watched him on TV gasping for air and thought, "This is our leader. He can't even lead a sentence." He lasted 13 months, died in March 80-5. Ronald Reagan in Washington was watching this parade of coffins and cracked a joke that was actually a profound strategic insight. How am I supposed to make peace with the Russians if they keep dying on me? It was funny, but it was also scary. A superpower with no brain is dangerous. It flows. But in March 1980-5, the Politburo, the ruling council of the USS, are finally realized that maybe, just maybe, they shouldn't elect another corpse. They looked around the room and saw a young man. Well, 50-4. In Soviet politics, that is basically a toddler. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was different. He had energy. He had hair mostly except for that famous birthmark that looked like a map of an island. He could walk without a cane. He could talk without a script. He had a charming wife named Teresa, who bought credit cards and wore stylish clothes. To the West, Gorbachev was a superstar. Gorby-mania swept Europe. Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady of Britain, famously said, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." But to the Soviet system, Gorbachev was a shock to the system. Imagine you work in a dusty, silent library where nobody has spoken above a whisper for 20 years, and suddenly a guy walks in with a boombox and opens all the windows. That was Gorbachev. He looked at the Soviet Union and saw what the old men refused to see. The country was rotting. Let us do a micro-sensory deep dive into Soviet life in 1980-5. The superpower that could launch space stations couldn't make decent shoes. The shoes would fall apart in a week. Why? Because the factory was paid based on quantity, not quality. So they made 1,000,000 terrible shoes to meet the quota. People stood in line. Queuing was a national sport. You would see a line and join it without knowing what it was for. Maybe it is sausage. Maybe it is toilet paper. Maybe it is just a line for another line. The smell of Soviet shops was distinct, a mix of bleached dust and pickled cabbage. The shelves were empty except for rows of dusty jars of birch juice and canned fish. Alcoholism was rampant. Vodka was cheaper than water. Men would drink cologne or window cleaner if they couldn't get vodka. The average life expectancy for a Russian man was dropping. The superpower was drinking itself to death to numb the boredom. Gorbachev saw this and decided to act. He introduced two famous words that would change history. Perestroika. Restructuring this was the economic plan. He wanted to loosen the grip of the state. Let factories make their own decisions. Let people open small businesses, cooperatives. He didn't want capitalism. He just wanted communism that actually worked. Glasnost openness. This was the political plan. He realized he couldn't fix the economy if people were afraid to tell the truth. So he said, "Let us talk. Let us criticize. Let us be honest about our problems." It sounded great. It was like he was trying to upgrade the software of the Soviet Union from version 1.0 to version 2.0. But he didn't realize that the hardware was broken. And then on April 26, 1996, the hardware literally exploded. Chernobyl. We need to stop here. We need to really look at this event because it is the pivot point of the entire decade. It is the moment the Soviet Union lost its soul. It is 1:23 a.m. Northern Ukraine. The technicians at the Lin nuclear power plant are running a safety test on reactor number 4. They are tired. They are under pressure to finish. They make mistakes. They disable the emergency shutdown system. They pull out the control rods. The reactor becomes unstable. The power spikes. The water turns to steam instantly. The unconcrete lid of the reactor is blown into the sky like a coin flip. The core is exposed. A beam of ionized blue light shoots up into the night. It looks beautiful. It looks like science fiction. But it is death. It is the core of the earth opened up. The firefighters arrive. They don't know it is radiation. They think it is a normal fire. They pick up pieces of graphite from the core with their bare hands. It's hot, they say. Those hands will rot off in a few weeks. They are walking dead men. They are breathing air that tastes like metal. That is the taste of radiation destroying your DNA. But the real crime isn't the explosion. It is the silence. The Soviet system's first instinct was to lie. Nothing happened. It is a minor fire. Keep calm. In the nearby city of Pripyat, people woke up the next morning and saw the smoke. But the radio played classical music. Children went to school. They played outside in the radioactive dust. Couples got married. They were bathing in a poison 500 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb. It took 36 hours to evacuate Pripyat. 36 hours of radiating 0 people. And they didn't tell the world. The radioactive cloud drifted north. It crossed the border. In Sweden, a worker at a nuclear plant triggered the radiation alarm when he walked into work. The Swedes were confused. Is our plant leaking? They checked. No. The radiation was coming from the wind, from the Soviet Union. The world demanded answers. Gorbachev was silent for days. Finally, he went on TV. He looked shaken. He admitted the disaster. This was the death blow to the Soviet system's credibility. How can you be a superpower if you can't boil water without poisoning a continent? And worse, how can you claim to be the party of the people when you let your own people's children play in nuclear ash just to save face? The cleanup was a war. They sent in liquidators, soldiers, miners, volunteers. They gave them lead aprons and shovels. They sent them onto the roof of the reactor to shovel radioactive graphite back into the hole. They could only work for 40 seconds at a time before receiving a lethal dose. They called them bio-robots because the actual robots kept frying from the radiation. Chernobyl cost the Soviet Union billions of rubles it didn't have, but the moral cost was infinite. Glasnost openness collided with the reality of Soviet lies. People started asking if they lied about this, what else are they lying about? The war in Afghanistan, the economy, the history books. The trust was gone. The contract between the state and the people was broken. But while the Soviet Union was melting down internally, externally things looked surprisingly hopeful. This is the era of the summit diplomacy. Reagan and Gorbachev, the odd couple. Reagan, the old anti-communist warrior. Gorbachev, the young reformer. They shouldn't have liked each other, but they did. They met in Geneva in 80-5. They shook hands. They looked into each other's eyes. Reagan wrote in his diary, "He is a convinced communist, but I think he is sincere." Then came Reykjavik 1996. This is a crazy story. They met in a spooky old house in Iceland. It was supposed to be a quick meeting about missiles, but it turned into a marathon negotiation. They kept raising the stakes. Gorbachev, we will cut our missiles by 50%. Reagan, okay, let's do it. Gorbachev, why not eliminate all medium-range missiles? Reagan, why not eliminate ALL nuclear weapons? Everything. Zero option. The advisors in the back room were sweating. They were having heart attacks. You can't just ban nukes. That is the whole basis of global security. They were this close to signing a deal to end the nuclear age. But there was one sticking point. Gorbachev, I will agree to zero nukes. But you have to give up SDI. You have to give up Star Wars. You can't build your space shield. Reagan refused. He loved his space shield. He believed it was moral. He said, I can't give up the defense of the American people. Gorbachev said, then, I can't sign. They walked out of the house. Their faces were grim. It looked like a failure. But actually, it was a breakthrough. It showed that they wanted to end the arms race. A year later in 1980-7, Gorbachev came to Washington. It was a love fest. He stopped his limo in the middle of D.C. and got out to shake hands with Americans. The crowd went wild. It was surreal. The leader of the evil empire was being treated like a rock star in America. They signed the INF Treaty. For the first time in history, they didn't just limit nukes, they eliminated a whole class of them. They agreed to destroy thousands of missiles. Why did Gorbachev do it? Was he just a nice guy? No, he was broke. This is the modern metaphor imagined to guys in a street race. One guy, America, is driving a brand new Ferrari paid for by credit cards deficit spending. The other guy, Russia, is driving a rusted Lada that is on fire. Gorbachev knew he couldn't win the race. He had to pull over. He had to stop spending 25% of his GDP on guns so he could spend it on butter. But the problem with perestroika, the economic reform, was that it wasn't working. It is really hard to be half-minus pregnant, and it is really hard to be half-minus capitalist. Gorbachev told the factories, you are free to make what you want, but he didn't set free prices. So factories made stuff nobody wanted, or they stopped making stuff that was unprofitable. The supply chains broke. Before reform you had bad shoes. After reform you had no shoes. Sugar disappeared from shelves because people were using it to make moonshine vodka. Soap disappeared. Matches disappeared. The Soviet Union in 1980-7 and 80-8 was a place of shortages, and glasnost freedom of speech made it worse. Now that people could complain, they complained LOUDLY. They read newspapers that told the truth about Stalin's crimes. They read about the luxury lives of the party elite. They got angry. And the anger wasn't just about food. It was about identity. The Soviet Union was an empire. It controlled 15 republics. Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, etc. For decades, the KGB kept a lid on ethnic tensions. But with glasnost, the lid came off. In 1980-8, a conflict broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, two Soviet republics, over a region called Nagorno-Karabakh. They started killing each other. Soviet citizens killing Soviet citizens. Gorbachev didn't know what to do. He sent in troops, but it was too little too late. It showed that Moscow was losing control. And then there was Afghanistan, the bleeding wound. By 1980-9, the war had been going on for nearly a decade. The Soviet army, the mighty Red Army, was being humiliated by guys in sandals with Stinger missiles. The Stinger was a game changer. The CIA gave them to the Mujahideen. Suddenly Soviet helicopters, the Hinds that terrorized the valleys, were falling out of the sky. Gorbachev realized the war was unwinnable. He decided to cut his losses. He announced the withdrawal. It was a retreat. It was a defeat. The soldiers came home, not to parades but to a country that didn't care. They were the AFGNC, broken men addicted to drugs, angry at the government. It was the Soviet version of the post-Vietnam trauma, but worse because they came home to a country that was falling apart. So as we approach the end of 1980, the stage is set for the final collapse. Gorbachev has opened the door to freedom, hoping fresh air will cure the patient. Instead, the fresh air is fanning the flames of nationalism and anger. He has made peace with the West, which is great. The fear of nuclear war is fading. Reagan and Gorbachev are buddies. But at home the shelves are empty. The people are furious. And the satellite states in Eastern Europe, Poland, East Germany, Hungary are watching. They see that the Soviet bear is toothless. They see that Gorbachev is unwilling to use force. They start to think, if he won't shoot the Armenians, maybe he won't shoot us. This brings us to the comment trap for this part. I want to ask you a question about Gorbachev. Is he a hero or a failure? In the West, we gave him the Nobel Peace Prize. We love him because he ended the Cold War without blood. But in Russia, he is often hated. They blame him for destroying the empire and bringing poverty. Who is right? Was he a visionary or just an incompetent manager who lost the keys to the store? And a quick brick joke setup. Remember how I said the Soviet computers were bad? In the 1980s, Soviet spies were desperately trying to steal Western tech. They stole plans for a microchip from an American company. They built a factory to clone it. But when they looked at the chip under a microscope, they found a tiny mess etched into the silicon by the American engineers. When you care enough to steal the very best, the Americans knew. They were rolling them on a microscopic level. So 1980-8 ends. The fuse is lit. The bomb is ticking. But nobody, not even the CIA, not even Gorbachev, knows how fast it is going to blow. Everyone thought the Soviet Union would last for another decade, maybe another century. But 1980-9 is coming. The year of miracles. The year everything changed. In the next part, we are going to watch the dominoes fall. We are going to see a picnic that destroys a border. We are going to see a press conference mistake that changes the map of the world. And we are going to see the Iron Curtain turned into scrap metal. Get ready. The wall is coming down. The year is 1980-9. If you are a historian, this is the year where everything happens all at once. It is like the season finale of a TV show where the writers decided to resolve every plotline in a single episode. For 40 years, the Cold War had been frozen. The Iron Curtain was a real thing. It was concrete. It was barbed wire. It was minefields. It divided Europe into two worlds that did not touch. On one side, you had Madonna and McDonald's. On the other side, you had Marx and misery. Everyone thought this division was permanent. The CIA thought the Berlin Wall would stand until the year 2050. Gorbachev thought he could reform the Soviet bloc without destroying it. They were all wrong. The collapse didn't start in Moscow or Berlin. It started in Poland. Poland was always the rebellious teenager of the Soviet family. They were Catholic, they were proud, and they hated the Russians. In the early 80s, they had formed a trade union called Solidarity. It was led by an electrician named Lech Walesa. He had a giant mustache and an even bigger attitude. The communists tried to crush Solidarity. They declared martial law. They arrested Walesa. But you can't arrest an idea. By 1980, the Polish economy was in freefall. Strikes were paralyzing the country. The communist government was broke and desperate. So they did something unthinkable. They invited Walesa to talk. They sat down at a round table. The communists thought they could trick Solidarity. They offered to hold semi-free elections. They reserved 65% of the seats in parliament for themselves, but allowed the opposition to run for the other 35% and for the newly created Senate. They thought, we control the TV, we control the police, we will win easily. The election happened on June 4, 1989. Fun fact, this is the same day as the Tiananmen Square crackdown in China. While tanks were rolling in Beijing, voters were walking to the polls in Warsaw. The result was a massacre, but a democratic one. Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. They won every single seat they were allowed to contest in the lower house. The communists didn't just lose, they were humiliated. Even their own members crossed out their names on the ballot. It was a shock. The Polish communists called Moscow. "Comrade Gorbachev, what do we do? Send the tanks?" And this is the moment the world changed. Under the old rules, the Brezhnev Doctrine, Gorbachev would have sent the Red Army to crush the counter-minus revolution. That is what happened in Hungary in '56 and Prague in '68. But Gorbachev said do nothing. It is their choice. This was the Sanatry Doctrine. Do it your way. Gorbachev thought that if he let Eastern Europe choose, they would choose socialism with a human face. He thought they would elect nice, friendly communists. He was delusional. He didn't realize that for these countries, communism was a foreign occupation. As soon as the threat of Russian tanks was removed, the whole system collapsed like a souffle. Poland got the first non-communist prime minister in the Eastern Bloc. The dominoes began to wobble. Next was Hungary. Hungary decided to be the cool communist country. They wanted to impress the West to get loans. So they decided to take down the barbed wire fence on their border with Austria. They held a ceremonial cutting of the fence. The foreign ministers of Austria and Hungary stood there with giant bolt cutters, smiling for the cameras. It was supposed to be a photo op. But the people of East Germany were watching on TV. East Germans were trapped. They couldn't travel to the West, but they could travel to other communist countries like Hungary. So they looked at the map. Wait, if I go to Hungary and the fence is down, can I just walk to Austria? And then to West Germany? It was a loophole. A glitch in the matrix. Thousands of East Germans packed their little Trabant cars. The Trabant was a terrible car made of plastic and cotton that sounded like a lawnmower and smoked like a chimney. But it was their car. They drove to Hungary. They went on vacation. And then they didn't come back. They walked across the border. They abandoned their cars on the side of the road. It was the Great Escape, but in slow motion. The East German government, the DDR, panicked. They were led by Erich Honecker. He was 70-7 years old and a hardline Stalinist. He hated change. He blocked travel to Hungary. So the refugees changed tactics. They went to the West German embassy in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Thousands of them climbed the fence into the embassy garden. They set up tents. They lived in the mud. There were babies crying. The toilets overflowed. It was a humanitarian crisis. On September 30th, the West German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher came out onto the balcony of the embassy. He looked down at the sea of desperate people. He announced, "We have reached an agreement with the DDR government. Today, your departure." The rest of the sentence was drowned out by a roar. The scream of thousands of people realizing they were free. It is one of the most emotional sounds in history. They were put on sealed trains to the west. As the trains passed through East German towns, people stood by the tracks and waved. It was a silent vote against the regime. Now the pressure moved to East Germany itself. The people who stayed behind were angry. They started meeting in churches. In Leipzig, they held Monday demonstrations. At first it was a few hundred people, then a few thousand, then 70,000. They marched with candles. They chanted, "Wir sind das Volk. We are the people." Honecker wanted to shoot them. He reportedly signed an order to use force. It could have been at Tiananmen Square in Europe, but his own party turned against him. They realized the game was up. They forced Honecker to resign. They replaced him with Egon Krenz. He was younger, but he had the same creepy smile. He tried to promise reforms. "We will open travel. We will have new laws." But it was too little too late. The people didn't want new laws. they wanted freedom. And then came the night of November 9th, 1989. This is the brick joke of bureaucracy. The most important event of the late 20th century happened because a guy didn't treat his notes properly. Gunter Schabowski was the spokesman for the East German Communist Party. He held a boring press conference in East Berlin. He was droning on about grain production and party congresses. The journalists were falling asleep. At the very end of the conference, almost as an afterthought, he remembered he had a piece of paper in his pocket. It was a new regulation about travel. It was supposed to say that people could apply for visas to travel starting tomorrow after following a strict bureaucratic process. But Schabowski hadn't read it. He skimmed it. He said, "We have decided that every citizen of the DDR can travel outside the country." A journalist asked, "When does that come into force?" Schabowski looked confused. He checked his paper. He shrugged. He said the most famous words in German history: "Das Ritt nach meiner Kenntnis. Ist das sofort unverziehlich. As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." Boom. The journalists raced to the phones. The wire services flashed the headline ISDGERNYOP and STHEBORDER. On West German TV, the news anchor announced the wall is open. It wasn't technically true. The guards hadn't been told. But the people of East Berlin heard it on TV. They put down their beers. They put on their coats. And they walked to the wall. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, a few people showed up. The guy on TV said, "We can cross." The guards said, "Go away. We have no orders." But Schabowski said immediately. Then 100 people. Then 1,000. Then 10,000. The commander of the checkpoint, Harald Jaeger, was freaking out. He called his superiors. "What do I do? There are thousands of them." The superiors said, "Do nothing. Keep the gate closed." "But they are pushing. They are going to crush the gate. Don't open it." Jaeger looked at the crowd. He looked at his men. His men were nervous. They had guns. But if they fired, they would start a massacre. Jaeger realized that history was happening on his watch. He had two choices: start a bloodbath or open the gate. At 11:30 p.m., he said, "Open the barrier." The gate went up. The crowd surged forward. They didn't run. They walked. And then they were greeted by West Berliners on the other side with champagne and flowers. Strangers hugged. People were crying. They climbed on top of the wall. They danced. For 20-8 years, this wall had been a death strip. People had been shot for touching it. Now they were chipping away pieces of it with hammers as souvenirs. It was the micro-sensory overload of joy. The sound of hammers chipping concrete. The smell of cheap East German T-stroke engine exhaust mixing with West German perfume. The sight of V-fingers in the air. David Hasselhoff, yes, the guy from Baywatch, stood on the wall, wearing a blinking jacket, singing "Looking for Freedom." It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was the end of an era. The fall of the Berlin Wall broke the back of the Soviet Empire. If Germany was gone, the rest of the bloc didn't stand a chance. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution happened a week later. It was called Velvet because it was so smooth and non-violent. The playwright Václav Havel went from being a prisoner to being president in a matter of weeks. The communist leadership just gave up. They realized they had no support. In Bulgaria, the old dictator Zhivkov was forced out by his own party. But there was one exception to the peaceful revolution: Romania. Romania was run by Nicolae Ceausescu. He was the mad king of Eastern Europe. He called himself the genius of the Carpathians. He lived in a giant palace while his people starved. He had a secret police, the Securitate, that terrified everyone. When the revolution started in the city of Timisoara, Ceausescu ordered the army to shoot. Men, women, and children were killed. Ceausescu thought he could still control the people. He organized a mass rally in Bucharest on December 21st. He stood on the balcony to give a speech. He expected applause. He always got applause because people were paid to clap. But this time something different happened. A boo, then a whistle. Then the crowd started chanting Timisoara. You can see the moment on video. Ceausescu looks confused. He waves his hand like he is swatting a fly. He taps the microphone. Hello? Hello? He realizes in that split second that he has lost his power. The look of shock on his face is the look of a tyrant realizing he is mortal. The rally turned into a riot. The army switched sides. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled by helicopter. They were captured. On Christmas Day 1989, they were put on trial. It was a kangaroo trial. It lasted an hour. They were sentenced to death. They were dragged outside and shot by a firing squad. The soldiers were so eager to shoot them that they started firing before the cameraman could even set up. It was a bloody end to a bloody year. So as 1989 ends, the map of Europe has been redrawn. The Iron Curtain is gone. The Berlin Wall is a pile of rubble. The Warsaw Pact is effectively dead, but the biggest domino is still standing. The Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev watched all of this happen. He let it happen. He thought, okay, the empire is gone, but the core remains. The Soviet Union is strong. We will reform. He was wrong. The virus of freedom had jumped the border. The Soviet republics were watching. The Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, the Georgians. They saw the East Germans dancing on the wall and they thought, why not us? The modern metaphor here is like a landlord who decides to stop evicting tenants who don't pay rent. Suddenly everyone stops paying rent, and then they start claiming they own the building. Gorbachev was the landlord, and his tenants were about to start a riot. This brings us to the common trap. I want to know, was the fall of the wall inevitable? Or was it just luck? If Schabowski hadn't messed up that press conference, if the Chinese crackdown had scared the East Germans, if Gorbachev had been a little more like Putin, would the wall still be standing today? Some people say history is driven by great forces, others say it is driven by accidents. What do you think? And a quick detail to bridge to the next part. In 1980-9, as the wall fell, a young KGB officer in Dresden, East Germany, was furiously burning secret documents. He was burning them so fast the furnace exploded. He called Moscow for help. He asked for troops to protect the KGB station from the crowds. Moscow told him, we cannot do anything without orders from the top. And Moscow is silent. That young officer was Vladimir Putin. Moscow is silent. That phrase haunted him. He felt betrayed. He felt the sting of empire collapsing. And he vowed that if he ever had power, Moscow would never be silent again. But that is the future. For now the party is raging in Berlin. The world feels safe. The Cold War seems over. But in part 4 we are going to see that the death of a superpower is not peaceful. It is messy. It involves tanks in Moscow, kidnapping a president, and the sudden disappearance of a country that covered 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The empire is about to strike back, and then it is going to die. The Berlin Wall was down. Eastern Europe was free. The world was having a massive hangover from the party of 1980-9. But in Moscow, the headache was just beginning. Mikhail Gorbachev was the most popular man in the world outside of the Soviet Union. In the West, he was Man of the Year. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But at home, he was the guy who broke the economy and lost the empire. In 1990, the Soviet Union started to look like a sweater that had caught a loose thread, and everyone was pulling on it. The first thread was Lithuania. This tiny Baltic nation had never wanted to be Soviet. Stalin had stolen them in 1940. In March 1990, they declared independence. They said, "We are out. Thanks for the memories which were terrible." This was huge. A Soviet republic declaring independence. It was illegal. It was treason. Gorbachev was furious. He cut off their oil. He sent tanks to drive through the streets of Vilnius. But he didn't order a massacre. He was trapped between his Nobel Peace Prize image and his duty to keep the country together. He was a vegetarian trying to work in a butcher shop. But the real threat wasn't the tiny Baltics. It was the giant in the middle of the room. Russia. This is confusing for Westerners. Isn't Russia the same as the Soviet Union? No. The Soviet Union was a federation of 15 republics. Russia was just the biggest one. And it had its own leader. Enter Boris Yeltsin. If Gorbachev was the smooth intellectual who wanted to fix the system, Yeltsin was the drunk construction boss who wanted to bulldoze it. Yeltsin was a populist. He had white hair, a deep voice, and a love for vodka that was legendary. He hated Gorbachev. He thought Gorbachev was too slow, too weak. Yeltsin got himself elected as the president of the Russian Republic. This created a bizarre situation. You had Gorbachev, president of the USSR, sitting in the Kremlin, and Yeltsin, president of Russia, sitting a few miles away. They were like two captains fighting over the steering wheel of the same sinking ship. Yeltsin started playing the nationalism card. He told the Russians, "Why are we paying for Uzbekistan? Why are we sending our oil to Ukraine? Russia should be rich. We should keep our own money." It worked. The Russian people were tired of feeding the empire. Throughout 1990 and early 90-1, the chaos grew. There were shortages of everything. Cigarettes disappeared. People blocked streets in Moscow demanding smokes. Red lines stretched around blocks. The modern metaphor here is that the Soviet economy was like a computer running Windows 95 in 2020. It was frozen. It was crashing. And hitting -Alt-delete wasn't working. Gorbachev tried one last Hail Mary pass. He proposed a new union treaty. He said, okay, you guys want independence. How about we turn the Soviet Union into a loose federation? You can manage your own economies, you can have your own laws, but we keep a common army and a common president. It was a desperate compromise. It was like a couple getting a divorce, but agreeing to still live in the same house. Most of the republic said maybe. A signing ceremony was scheduled for August 20th, 1991. But there were men in the shadows who hated this plan. The hardliners, the head of the KGB Vladimir Krykov, the Minister of Defense Dmitry Yazov, the Vice President Gennady Yanayev. These guys were old school. They looked at Gorbachev and saw a traitor. They looked at the new Union Treaty and saw the death of the superpower. They decided to act. On August 4th, Gorbachev went on vacation to his villa in Furos, Crimea. He needed a break. He was exhausted. On August 18th, the hardliners flew to Crimea. They walked into his villa. They told him declare a state of emergency. Hand over power. Or else. Gorbachev, to his credit, told them to go to hell. He refused to sign. So they cut his phone lines. They surrounded the villa with KGB guards. They took away the nuclear briefcase, the Cheget. The leader of the Soviet Union was a prisoner in his own vacation home. The next morning, August 19th, 1991, the world woke up to a shock. Soviet TV and radio announced Mikhail Gorbachev is ill. He cannot perform his duties. A state committee on the state of emergency, GKCHP, has taken over to save the country from chaos. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Tanks rolled into Moscow. T-72 seconds rumbled down boulevards. Paratroopers secured the intersections. It looked like 1950-6 or 1960-8 all over again. The empire was striking back. But this is where the character tropes of the plotters failed them. They were incompetent. They were the gang that couldn't shoot straight. They held a press conference. Vice President Yana Yev sat there. His hands were shaking. I mean visibly trembling. He looked like he was about to vomit. He was drunk. He couldn't answer questions. The journalists started laughing at him. A journalist asked, "Do you understand that you have carried out a coup d'etat?" Yana Yev stuttered. It was pathetic. The image of his shaking hands was beamed around the world. It showed that the coup had no confidence, and they made a fatal mistake. They didn't arrest Boris Yeltsin. They surrounded the White House, the Russian parliament building, with tanks, but they didn't storm it. Yeltsin was inside. He realized this was his moment. He walked out of the building. He climbed onto a tank. Tank No. 110. The soldiers inside were confused. They were just kids. Yeltsin shook their hands. He stood on top of the turret. He gave a speech. His voice boomed. He called the coup illegal. He called the plotters criminals. He called for a general strike. It was the most iconic image of the collapse. The rebel leader standing on the enemy's tank defying the whole Red Army. CNN broadcast it live. The whole world saw it. The Russian people saw it. Thousands of Muscovites rushed to the White House. They built barricades out of buses, dumpsters, and park benches. They formed a human chain around the building. They were ready to die to protect their fragile democracy. Among them was a famous cellist, Stanislav Rostropovich, who had flown in from Paris. He sat in the building holding a rifle. It was surreal. The plotters in the Kremlin panicked. They ordered the Alpha Group Elite KB Special Forces to storm the building. Kill everyone. Take Yeltsin. The Alpha Group commanders looked at the order. They looked at the thousands of civilians outside. They looked at the live CNN feed. They refused. We will not shoot our own people. When the KGB refuses to kill for you, you know it is over. On the night of August 20th, there was a skirmish. 3 civilians were killed trying to stop a tank column. But the massive assault never came. By the morning of August 21st, the coup collapsed. The soldiers turned their tanks around. The plotters realized they had lost. Some of them got drunk. Some of them fled to the airport. The Minister of Interior shot himself. Gorbachev was freed. He flew back to Moscow. But when he stepped off the plane, he looked different. He looked like a ghost. He was still the president, but his power was gone. Yeltsin was the hero. He was the king. At a session of the parliament, Yeltsin humiliated Gorbachev. He forced him to read a document aloud. He signed a decree banning the Communist Party in Russia right in front of Gorbachev's face. Gorbachev tried to protest, but Yeltsin just pointed at the paper. Read it. It was brutal. It was the alpha male asserting dominance over the fallen leader. The Communist Party, the organization that had ruled for 74 years, was banned. Its assets were seized. Its offices were sealed. The spine of the Soviet Union was snapped. Now the unraveling accelerated. Ukraine declared independence on August 24th. This was the nail in the coffin. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union was just Russia and some deserts. Ukraine was the breadbasket, the industrial heartland. Gorbachev tried to keep the Union together. He kept talking about a confederation. He was like a captain shouting orders on the Titanic after the ship had already snapped in half. Nobody was listening. On December 1st, Ukraine held a referendum. 92% voted for independence. On December 8th, the leaders of the 3 Slavic republics, Yeltsin, Russia, Kravchuk, Ukraine, Shushke, Evich, Belarus, met at a hunting lodge in the Bielorussia, Cheskaya, Pushcha forest. They didn't invite Gorbachev. They drank vodka. They ate wild boar. And they signed a piece of paper. The Bielorussia Accords. It said, simply, the Soviet Union as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality ceases to exist. Just like that. 3 guys in a cabin ended a superpower. They created a vague thing called the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, just to make it look legal. But really, it was a divorce settlement. They called Gorbachev to tell him. Actually, they called President Bush first. That was the ultimate insult. They told the American president, "Hey, the USSR is gone," before they told the Soviet president. Gorbachev was furious but powerless. He had no country to lead. On December 25, 1991, Christmas Day, the final act played out. Gorbachev sat at his desk in the Kremlin. He signed his resignation letter. He gave a televised speech. He looked sad. He said, "I tried to reform the country. I tried to give you freedom." He put down his pen. At 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag with the golden hammer and sickle was lowered from the flagpole above the Kremlin. It flapped in the cold wind one last time and then came down. Moments later, the Russian tricolor flag, white, blue, red, was raised. There was no civil war. There was no nuclear apocalypse. The Soviet Union didn't die with a bang. It died with a signature and a flag change. The Cold War was over. America had won. But let us pause for the micro-sensory reality of that winter. For the average Russian, December 1991 wasn't about geopolitical victory or defeat. It was about hunger. The shops were empty. Money was worthless. People were selling their personal belongings on the street just to buy bread. Old grandmothers stood in the snow selling one pair of socks or a silver spoon. The superpower had collapsed into poverty. This trauma, the humiliation of poverty, the loss of empire, the chaos, would scar the Russian psyche for generations. It explains everything that happened later. It explains why they eventually turned to a strongman like Putin. They didn't want freedom anymore. They wanted food and order. But that is for part 5. For now, let us look at the comment trap. I want to ask, do you think the Soviet Union could have been saved? If the coup hadn't happened, if they had signed the treaty, could a democratic Soviet Union have worked? Or was it doomed from the start? Was it a prison of nations that had to explode? And a quick brick joke payoff. Remember in part 1, or the aborted draft, I mentioned that the Soviets were obsessed with knowing if the Americans were keeping the lights on at the Pentagon. Well, in 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the lights at the Pentagon were on all night. Not because they were planning an attack, but because they were watching CNN, just like everyone else, wondering where are the nukes? Who has the codes? The fear had reversed. The Americans weren't afraid of a strong Soviet Union anymore. They were afraid of a weak one. Loose nukes. Hungry scientists selling secrets. The New World Order was starting with a new kind of panic. So the map is redrawn. There are 15 new countries. The world is unipolar. The US is the undisputed king. But as we will see in the final part, winning the Cold War was the easy part. Surviving the peace, that is much harder. We are going to look at the legacy of the Cold War, the rise of the oligarchs, the loose nukes, the war on terror, and how the ghost of the Soviet Union still haunts us today. The flag came down. The Soviet Union was dead. The West popped the champagne. We won. Game over. History is finished. Everyone is going to be a liberal democracy now, and we will all drink Coca-Cola and watch Friends forever. Francis Fukuyama famously wrote a book called The End of History. He basically said, that's it, folks. Democracy won. No more big conflicts. Spoiler alert, history was not dead. It was just taking a power nap. And when it woke up, it was grumpy, hung over and looking for a fight. Welcome to the 90s. In America, it was a decade of optimism. The economy boomed. The internet was born. The biggest problem the president had was a scandal involving a blue dress. It felt like a vacation from history. But in Russia, it was the apocalypse. We need to understand this because it explains everything happening today. To the West, the collapse of the USSR was a liberation. To the Russians, it was a catastrophe. Imagine if tomorrow the US government disappeared, the dollar became worthless, the police stopped answering calls, and your state declared independence. That was Russia in the 90s. Boris Yeltsin, the hero on the tank, turned out to be, well, not a great administrator. He introduced shock therapy. He privatized everything overnight. He handed out vouchers to citizens and said, "Here, you own a piece of the factory." But the average Russian didn't know what a voucher was. They were hungry. So they sold their vouchers for a bottle of vodka or a bag of potatoes. And who bought them? The guys who had cash. The black marketeers. The former KGB agents. The guys who knew how to game the system. They bought the factories, the oil wells, the nickel mines for pennies on the dollar. They became the oligarchs, a tiny group of men who owned half of Russia. They bought yachts the size of aircraft carriers, while pensioners were eating dog food. It was the Wild West. Gangsters ruled the streets. If you opened a kiosk selling cigarettes, the mafia would show up and ask for protection money. If you didn't pay, they firebombed you. The murder rate skyrocketed. Life expectancy for men dropped to 50-7 years. This was democracy to the average Russian, and they hated it. They looked at the chaos and thought, if this is freedom, give me back the gulag. Yeltsin himself was erratic. He drank a lot. There is a famous story where he was visiting Washington, D.C., staying at Blair House. The Secret Service found him at 3 a.m. standing on Pennsylvania Avenue, in his underwear, trying to hail a taxi because he wanted a pizza. The world laughed. Look at Boris. He is so fun. But the Russians weren't laughing. They felt humiliated. Their leader was a clown. Their empire was gone. Their dignity was in the trash. And while Russia was imploding, the wreckage of the Cold War was sparking fires everywhere else. Let us look at Yugoslavia. It was a communist federation, just like the USSR. When the Cold War ended, the glue holding it together melted. It exploded into ethnic civil war. Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo. Neighbors who had lived together for 40 years started slaughtering each other. The West had to intervene. NATO bombed Belgrade in 1990-9. To the West, it was a humanitarian mission. To Russia, it was NATO bombing their Slavic Orthodox brothers. It was another humiliation. They couldn't stop it. Then there was the issue of NATO expansion. When Germany reunited, the US Secretary of State James Baker famously told Gorbachev that NATO would move not 1 inch eastward. Historians argue about whether this was a formal promise or just a chat, but the Russians definitely heard it as a promise. But in the 90s, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic knocked on NATO's door. Hey, remember those Russian tanks? We are still scared of them. Can we join your club? Clinton said yes. NATO expanded. The alliance moved right up to Russia's borders. The Russians screamed betrayal. You said you wouldn't expand. You are encircling us. The West said relax, it is a defensive alliance. We aren't threatening you. It is the classic security dilemma. What looks like defense to one side looks like aggression to the other. And then on New Year's Eve 1999, Boris Yeltsin went on TV. He looked sick. He mumbled. He said, "I am tired. I am leaving." He appointed a successor, a quiet man, a former KGB officer who had served in East Germany, a man with cold blue eyes and a face that never moved. Vladimir Putin. Putin was the anti-Yeltsin. He didn't drink. He did judo. He spoke clearly. He promised one thing: order. He told the oligarchs, you can keep your money, but stay out of politics. If you cross me, I will destroy you. He proved it by throwing Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, in jail for 10 years. He told the Chechen rebels who were trying to break away, we will pursue you everywhere. If we catch you in the toilet, we will waste you in the outhouse. The Russian people loved it. They didn't care about freedom of the press. They wanted a strong czar who would make Russia respected again. Putin rebuilt the Russian economy mostly thanks to high oil prices. He rebuilt the military. And he started to push back. He called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. He wasn't trying to bring back communism. He didn't care about Marx. He was trying to bring back the empire. Meanwhile, the US was distracted. Why? Because the Cold War's other ghost had come back to haunt them. Remember Afghanistan. Remember the Mujahideen, the holy warriors we armed to fight the Soviets. Well, after the Soviets left, we just left. We didn't build schools. We didn't build roads. We left a country full of guns and religious fanatics. Civil war broke out. A group called the Taliban took over. They hosted a wealthy Saudi extremist named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had fought the Soviets. Now he turned his sights on the far enemy, the United States. On September 11, 2000, when the Cold War officially ended and the war on terror began. For a brief moment, Putin and Bush were friends. Putin was the first to call Bush after 9/11 this. He said, "We know what terrorism is. We will help you." He hoped for a partnership, but it fell apart. The US invaded Iraq. Putin hated that. The US-backed color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine pro-minus democracy uprisings. Putin saw these not as people power, but as CIA plots to encircle Russia. The relationship soured. The new Cold War began to freeze. Fast forward to today. We are living in the wreckage of the Soviet collapse. The war in Ukraine. That is just the aftershock of 1991. Putin is trying to reverse the verdict of history. He wants to reclaim the Russian world. The tension with China? That is the other communist giant that didn't collapse. They watched Gorbachev and learned a lesson. Never give up political power. Fix the economy but keep the tanks ready. They saw Tiananmen Square as a success and Glasnost as a suicide note. So here we are. The world is divided again. But it is messier. It isn't just red versus blue. It is autocracy versus democracy. It is cyber war. It is disinformation. The modern metaphor for the Cold War legacy is like nuclear waste. The power plant, the USSR, is shut down, but the fuel rods are still hot. They will be toxic for 10,000 years. You can't just bury them and forget them. They leak. The KGB didn't disappear. It just changed its name to the FSB and took over the government. The nuclear weapons didn't disappear. They are still in the silos pointed at your city right now. The paranoia didn't disappear. It just moved to the internet where troll farms sow division on Facebook. So what is the final verdict? Who won the Cold War? America won the battle. The Soviet Union collapsed. But did we win the peace? That is debatable. We missed the chance to integrate Russia. We let Afghanistan rot until it bit us. We became complacent. We thought freedom was inevitable. We thought democracy was the default setting of humanity. We were wrong. Democracy is a garden. You have to water it. You have to weed it. If you ignore it, the jungle grows back. And the jungle is growing back right now. But I want to end on a hopeful note. Or at least a human one. Let us go back to the brick joke one last time. Remember the red phone? The hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is still there. It has been upgraded. It is not a red phone anymore. It is a secure computer link. In 2016, right before the election, President Obama used it. He sent a message to Putin warning him to stop hacking. It proves that we are still in the same game. The technology changes from telegrams to emails, but the dynamic is the same. Two guys into rooms trying not to blow up the world while playing poker with the future of humanity. And the callback to the very beginning. Remember the candy bomber, Gail Halvorsen? He died in 2022 at the age of 101. Until the very end, he was still visiting schools. He was still talking about how the sticks of gum can change the world. He proved that soft power, kindness, culture, chocolate is stronger than hard power. The Soviet Union had more tanks than anyone, but it couldn't make a decent pair of jeans. And in the end, the jeans won. The lesson of the Cold War isn't about missiles. It is about people. People want to be free. They want to travel. They want to listen to rock and roll. You can build a wall, you can build a gulag, you can build a firewall. But eventually the human spirit finds a crack. Water always wins against rock. It just takes time. So here is the final common trap. Look at the world today. We have a rising China, a Revan Sea, hissed Russia, and a divided America. Are we heading for World War III? Or is this just Cold War to electric boogaloo? And who do you think will win this time? The authoritarian model efficient but brutal, or the democratic model messy but free? Let me know. And please keep it civil. We don't need a nuclear exchange in the comments section. Thank you for watching this entire series. We covered 70 years of history. From the ashes of WWII to the Berlin Wall to the rise of Putin. It is a crazy story. And the scary part is we are still writing the next chapter. If you enjoyed this deep dive, if you learned something, if you laughed at my terrible jokes, please subscribe. Share it with a friend who thinks the Cold War was just about Rocky IV. And remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So keep your eyes open. This is your favorite history storyteller signing off. Stay safe, stay free, and for the love of God, don't invade Russia in the winter.